The news from Kampala arrived abruptly. It was late July 2024. The Ugandan military had taken control. Soldiers were visible on the streets of the capital. They occupied key government installations. The reasons provided by the military leadership were familiar. They spoke of a need to restore order. They cited rampant corruption as a primary concern. The takeover, they claimed, was a necessary step to cleanse the nation. For many Ugandans, the pronouncements were met with a mixture of apprehension and cautious hope. The long rule of President Yoweri Museveni, in power since 1986, had created a political landscape resistant to change. While some credited him with bringing a degree of stability after turbulent decades, others pointed to a growing democratic deficit. The military's intervention, therefore, was not entirely unexpected by keen observers of the region. The question on everyone's lips was simple. What would this new chapter truly mean for the ordinary Ugandan citizen, weary of political uncertainty and economic hardship? The military spokespersons were quick to address the nation. They broadcast messages across state television and radio. They promised a swift return to civilian rule once their objectives were met. Yet, the path from military intervention to genuine, sustainable reform is fraught with challenges, both internal and external, for this complex nation. The military takeover of July 2024 did not occur in a vacuum. It was the culmination of years, even decades of mounting frustrations. President Museveni's lengthy tenure, while initially seen by some as a stabilizing force, increasingly became a focal point of discontent. Many Ugandans, particularly the burgeoning youth population, felt alienated from a political system that seemed to offer them little voice or opportunity. Economic woes, including high unemployment and rising living costs, further fueled this sense of disillusionment. Corruption had become deeply entrenched within the state apparatus. Public funds were often reported as being diverted, and accountability seemed a distant dream. This systemic graft eroded public trust in institutions. The political opposition, though active, faced significant challenges. Restrictions on assembly and expression were common. Key opposition figures often found themselves targeted by state security forces. Uganda's history is also marked by periods of political instability and military intervention. The shadow of figures like Idi Amin loomed large in the collective memory. The military's re-emergence onto the political center stage in 2024, therefore, tapped into complex historical precedents. The immediate precursor to the military's intervention was a significant surge in public protest. In early July 2024, Uganda witnessed a wave of demonstrations, predominantly led by its youth. These young people, often referred to as the Gen Z movement, were tech-savvy and well-connected. They drew inspiration from similar protest movements in neighboring Kenya. Social media platforms became crucial tools for organizing and disseminating information. The protests, often coalescing under the banner of March to Parliament, were concentrated in the capital, Kampala. Young Ugandans, students, and other concerned citizens took to the streets in considerable numbers. Their grievances were clear and directly addressed the issues of corruption and poor governance. They were not calling for a military takeover. Instead, their demands were focused on accountability within the existing civilian structures. The energy and determination of these young demonstrators were palpable, representing a significant challenge to the established order. The scale of these demonstrations was noteworthy. Reports indicated that this was the largest protest movement Uganda had seen since December 2021. The July 2024 protests, however, had a sharper political edge. The July 2024 protesters focused on corruption, demanding the resignation of Parliamentary Speaker Anita Among. Among was sanctioned by the U.S. over corruption allegations, symbolizing impunity in the political elite. Her removal became a rallying cry for systemic reforms against graft. Protesters demanded transparency and accountability in government. The March to Parliament movement targeted the legislative branch, urging it to hold the executive accountable. Their call was for a fairer distribution of resources and a more equitable society. The Ugandan authorities' response to the burgeoning protest movement in July 2024 was predictable, yet disheartening for those seeking peaceful change. Police forces were heavily deployed in Kampala and other urban centers where demonstrations were planned or taking place. While many of the protests maintained a peaceful character, with demonstrators attempting to voice their grievances through non-violent means, the state's reaction was often forceful. Reports indicated that police forces actively disrupted nearly half of all protest events, creating an atmosphere of tension and confrontation on the streets. Dozens of demonstrators were arrested during these confrontations. The arrests targeted not only those perceived as ringleaders, but also ordinary participants. Such actions are often intended to intimidate and deter further mobilization. However, they can also have the unintended consequence of galvanizing opposition and drawing more attention to the protesters' cause. The images of young Ugandans being bundled into police vehicles circulated widely, both domestically and internationally, further highlighting the government's intolerance of dissent. Despite the heavy police presence and the arrests, the protesters showed remarkable resilience. Over 80% of the demonstrations reportedly remained peaceful on the part of the participants. This underscored the genuine desire of many Ugandans for a non-violent resolution to their grievances. However, the repeated clashes with security forces created an environment of escalating instability. The government seemed unwilling or unable to engage constructively with the protesters' demands, opting instead for a security-led approach. The situation reached its denouement on July 22, 2024. On this day, the Ugandan military officially announced it had taken control of the country. The preceding weeks of youth-led protests and the government's often heavy-handed response had created a volatile atmosphere. The military leadership stated that their intervention was necessary to restore order and stability. They also explicitly referenced the anti-corruption grievances that had fueled the demonstrations, positioning themselves as agents of necessary reform. The mechanics of the takeover followed a familiar pattern. Key government buildings in Kampala were swiftly secured by military personnel. Access to strategic locations, including the parliamentary buildings and state broadcasters, was restricted. There were reports of some political leaders and senior government officials being detained or placed under house arrest. The military sought to quickly establish its authority and control the narrative surrounding its actions. In their initial pronouncements, the new military leaders sought to reassure the population and the international community. They emphasized their commitment to tackling the deep-seated corruption that the protesters had highlighted. They also spoke of improving governance, and eventually, overseeing a transition back to civilian rule. The sight of soldiers patrolling the streets and the suspension of normal political processes marked a profound shift for Uganda. The military takeover in Uganda did not go unnoticed by the international community. Reactions were swift and for the most part, condemnatory. The United States and many Western nations, long-standing partners of Uganda in various development and security initiatives, were quick to denounce the unconstitutional change of government. They called for a speedy return to civilian rule and expressed concerns about the potential impact on human rights and democratic processes. Such statements are standard diplomatic responses, but they carry weight, particularly when tied to aid and other forms of international cooperation. Regional powers within East Africa and the broader African continent also voiced their concerns. The African Union, adhering to its protocols against unconstitutional changes of government, was expected to take a position. Neighboring countries, mindful of Uganda's strategic location and its role in regional stability, watched developments closely. Political instability in Uganda has the potential to create ripple effects across the region, impacting trade, security cooperation, and refugee flows. Therefore, the desire for a quick and peaceful resolution was paramount among Uganda's neighbors, even if their public statements varied in tone and directness. The implications of these international reactions for Uganda under military rule are significant. Condemnation can translate into tangible consequences, such as the suspension of development aid, targeted sanctions against military leaders, or Uganda's suspension from international bodies. These measures can exert considerable pressure on a new regime. The diplomatic challenge lies in calibrating the response to encourage a return to democratic norms without unduly harming the Ugandan people. In the immediate aftermath of the July 2024 takeover, Uganda found itself under direct military rule. The new leadership moved to consolidate its authority, making key appointments and issuing directives. They reiterated their commitment to addressing the core issues that, they claimed, necessitated their intervention, primarily corruption and the restoration of effective governance. Statements were made promising a new era of discipline and accountability. For a populace weary of the perceived excesses and inertia of the previous administration, such words might have offered a sliver of hope, however tentative. The military council or junta that assumed power outlined a broad agenda for reform. This often includes promises to review and revise the constitution, overhaul state institutions, and prosecute individuals implicated in corruption. Such undertakings are monumental tasks, requiring significant political will, resources, and expertise. The challenge for any military regime is to demonstrate that it possesses not only the force to seize power, but also the capacity to govern effectively and justly. However, military rule inherently carries significant perils. The suspension of constitutional order, even if temporary, can lead to a curtailment of fundamental rights and freedoms. Freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, and due process can all be compromised when security imperatives overshadow civilian legal frameworks. As Uganda navigates this period, nearly a year since the takeover, the long-term intentions of the military leadership remain a subject of intense speculation. The promise of an eventual return to civilian rule is a standard feature of such interventions. Uganda's political history is deeply intertwined with military interventions. The coup of July 2024 is another chapter in a long and turbulent narrative. Uganda has experienced several military takeovers, most infamously Idi Amin's brutal regime in 1971. President Museveni, ousted in 2024, also came to power through a military coup in 1986. The military has always been a significant force in Ugandan politics. Recurring coups point to weaknesses in civilian governance and democratic institutions. When peaceful political change is blocked, the military can be seen as a viable alternative. The challenges facing Uganda under its current military leadership are immense. Beyond maintaining security, the regime must address the issues that led to the takeover. Tackling corruption requires robust reforms and a commitment to the rule of law. Improving governance necessitates inclusivity and engaging with diverse viewpoints. The international community and Ugandan citizens yearn for stability and a government that serves their interests.